Well, thank you for coming, everyone. It's really fun to see all your faces, and I'm deeply grateful that you took the time to join us this evening. When Alicia, again, as I said earlier, when she proposed this, I thought about ways that I could combine things that I've really enjoyed studying with my life at Commonwealth. And what I should tell you is about 7 years into my career at Commonwealth in 1992 and 3, I received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to undertake a full year's project studying. And what I worked on were the dialogues of Plato, and particularly looking at the form, his use of the dialogue form and scholarship on that. And it's interesting because, you know, Plato was interested in teaching. And what I realized over the years is that a lot of the stuff that I'd gotten then and a lot of what he talked about are things that I observed and that were relevant to Commonwealth, and particularly to Commonwealth's distinctiveness, especially its distinctiveness as a small school where teachers and students work closely face to face. A lot, and I also can make the case that a lot of modern educational theory about teaching the whole child, about social emotional learning, about student-centered education, about teaching for understanding, these are all sort of, you know, educational buzzwords. They echo, all of those echo in different garb, things that I think are touched on in some of the stuff that I'll present tonight. I, in my mind over the years, have drawn connections between these two and learned from them, between Plato and sort of what I observed at Commonwealth and Commonwealth's culture. But I've generally spared others my pedantry. So this is nice because today is my chance to kind of bust loose. And so what I can do is I'm going to, Cohen, I think you asked whether this will be on the test. Well, here's the pop quiz. I hope you guys, did you guys do the reading? That's question number one. I hope you did, but if not, it's not a serious matter. The place to begin is to orient people is what philosophy was to the ancients. Pierre Hadot was a French scholar of philosophy, passed away a few years ago. He was quite influential. If any of you, those of you who've read anything by Michel Foucault, Foucault attended Hadot's lectures on ancient philosophy. But he makes the point, we think philosophy today is very much an academic discipline and focuses on explanation and the like. But as it says in this quote, philosophy to the ancients did not consist in teaching an abstract theory, but rather in the art of living. It raises the individual from an inauthentic condition of life, darkened by unconsciousness and harassed by worry, to an authentic state of life in which one attains awareness, a clear vision of the world, inner peace, don't know how much of that we impart, and freedom. And so, and Hadot actually makes the argument that after Plato, among a lot of the different sort of post-Socratic schools, Stoics, Epicureans, and the like, that the theory was really not the point. The theoretical armature of the Epicureans, of the Stoics, and of the skeptics ultimately aimed to cultivate sort of an attitude of detachment to free one from the fears and the passions that clouded life with anxiety. And I thought I also would put up front here the mission of the school: to educate young people from diverse backgrounds to become knowledgeable, thoughtful, creative adults, capable of careful analysis, fruitful cooperation, responsible leadership, and deep commitment. You know, there's some overlap there. You know, the aims of the ancients are not far from ours as a school. We don't mention inner peace, but we want our graduates to see and to think clearly. And so that kind of lays the groundwork here. Yeah, I think. So at the beginning of his dialogue, the Meno, who is kind of this arrogant young noble from northern Greece sort of abruptly begins the dialogue with this blunt question to Socrates. Can you tell me, Socrates, whether excellence, and the Greek word there is arete, can be taught, or if not taught, acquired through practice? Or is it neither acquired through practice nor learned, but something that comes to men by nature or in some other way? And the word he uses that's translated excellence is often translated as virtue, but we have to understand it as virtue broadly construed, sort of the development of humans, the human powers and skills that we have, intellectual powers, moral powers, and that's the way we use virtue today, and physical powers. However, Homeric heroes displayed, arete or excellence on the battlefield. But Meno's asking a question, about what's possible in education. Can you work with young people and teach them how to think clearly, teach them how to, to think and act ethically? In my very first faculty meeting at Commonwealth School, we were going around the table and introducing ourselves, and I quoted actually a Renaissance Platonist philosopher who talked about, the aim of education is really to educate young people to be good. And a longtime teacher at the school, Dane Morgan, sort of growled in response. He came right after me and he growled in response. He said, we can't teach them to be good. It's a tough world out there. We got to teach them to be tough. Despite Dane's sort of comeback, I've never quite given up on this. So here's the aim of education as we look at it. It's more than skill development. As I've always talked about what distinguishes, what's important about Commonwealth, it's more than about skill development, certainly more than about career preparation. It's about helping young people unfold into the young adults with their powers developed as fully as we can develop them. Today, again, we talk about things like the whole child, but I think that's become, again, a sort of buzzword. All right, so let's go to your reading. What I want to focus on is the way that we engage with students. I've said in the past, teaching at Commonwealth, and I've written in the past as well, that teaching at Commonwealth is relational. It grows out of a relationship between a teacher and student. But there's more to it than that. And this is a quotation from that longer passage that was in your handout, where Plato criticizes writing, in fact. He who thinks that he's left behind him any art in writing, he who receives it in the belief that anything in writing will be clear and certain would be an utterly simple person, and in truth ignorant of the prophecy of Ammon, this Egyptian king, if he thinks written words are of any use except to remind him who knows the matter about which they are written. And he has the strange quality, is very like the painting, for creatures of painting stand like living beings, but if one asks them a question, they preserve a solemn silence. And so it is with written words. You might think they spoke as if they had intelligence, but if you would question them, wishing to know about their sayings, they always say only one and the same thing. And every word, when once it is written, is bandied about alike among those who understand and those who have no interest in it. And it knows not whom to speak, or not to speak. When ill-treated or unjustly reviled, it always needs its father to help it, for it has no power to protect or help itself. Now, Plato was writing at a time, so the dialogue is set in the late 5th century BCE. Plato's writing perhaps 40 years after this, but the time that he is writing was a time, writing was a revolution in communication technology. It was still underway in the 4th century. Athens and Greece was in a transition from an oral culture to written. Athenian written laws had been put up in the public square 2 centuries earlier, Books were available in Socrates' time, but they were rare. But an important thing to remember about writing, is that people didn't read silently. Writing was something that was presented, that you read it aloud, and you generally read it to other people. And Phaedrus, the character whom Socrates engages with in this dialogue, is actually going out of town with a scroll under his cloak, because he wants to rehearse this speech written by a great orator, Lysias, rehearse it aloud so that he could present it from memory. And Socrates goes, that's what provokes Socrates' question. Okay. Now, that was the revolution in communication technology of in 5th century Athens. We saw another one the world saw another one in Europe in 1439 with Gutenberg and movable type and the printing press, which made possible much broader dissemination of books and information. And the culture became a much more literate and literary culture. And then in the 20th century, we have the revolution of mass media, which has been written about by Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman. Postman is somebody I read quite a bit on mass media. I would recommend Amusing Ourselves to Death if you're interested. He writes about the effects of television. And each of these media have their strengths, have things that they do very well, and they have things that they don't do so well. Plato here is outlining what he sees as a shortcoming of writing. At the same time, though, writing allows communication of complex information, complex arguments. Its strengths and its powers are different from those of speech. And mass media, its power, there's an emotional immediacy there that is, it communicates in a different way, very different way from the way that writing or face-to-face oral communication does. If there were time, it'd be interesting to talk about writing's virtues. Again, the ability to trace longer, complicated narratives and arguments, and the immediacy and emotional directness of video. But a book that I read early in my career by Neil Postman is called Teaching as a Conserving Activity. And his response to mass media was parallel to kind of like Plato's response to writing. Postman basically was worried about the way that mass media would transform education into entertainment. And he said what was interesting is at the time, there were a lot of people talking about the need to incorporate mass media into education. Television was going to be this powerful educational tool. And his argument was young people growing up in this environment, they live with this stuff. Teaching them using this is kind of like teaching fish to swim. It doesn't make sense. He said, what we have to do is we have to teach the skills that they are not getting in the media in which they are immersed, in order to make sure that those strengths and those intellectual and intellectual powers aren't ignored. And so he saw education in schools as a sort of counterweight to whatever the dominant media environment people were growing up in was. And we're now in yet another revolution with social media. And I think people are just beginning to come to grips with the effects of this sort of personalized, the possibility for sort of personalized mass communication. And I would recommend, if you want to read or hear some interesting people on that, James Williams' Stand Out of Our Light has written a very powerful book on what technology and social media do to human attention spans and to human communities. Tristan Harris, who's a former chief design ethicist at Google, and now founder of the Center for Humane Technology, also talks about this. But for today, I want to talk about what Plato was after, and how what Plato said approximates what we're after, which has to do with understanding and dialogue. Okay. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post away. Okay. So here are the problems Plato spells out with writing. He said it weakens memory. All right. You know, if it's written down on a page, you don't have to hold it in your head. It fosters an illusory sense of wisdom. The command of information is not necessarily the same as wisdom. It can't give an answer when questioned, but continues saying the same thing. And it cannot suit its message to its audience in particular. It does not know how to speak to those with whom it should, and stay silent with whom it shouldn't. And finally, when it's attacked, it can't defend itself. So to go back to what I was saying about teaching at Commonwealth arising out of relations, the example I love to use is that when I started doing admissions for the school in 1993, these 8th graders would come into my office and they would sit down and I'd say, what subjects do you really like? What are you really interested in? And their answers would always be about a teacher whom they really liked. Well, I have a great history teacher. And it took me a little while where I heard that as kind of the wrong answer, but then I realized the problem was mine. They were giving me the right answer that they had. Because what I also saw is that when these kids came to Commonwealth, if they were in biology and they had Mr. Robinson or today Ms. Sundberg, and they had a teacher who knew them and who liked them and whom they liked, they would want to please that teacher. And the way that you please that teacher is you throw yourself into the subject and you work hard. And and we all know the experience that once we start working hard at something and once we dig a little bit deeper into it, it sort of dawns on you that, hey, this stuff is kind of interesting. And in fact, the learning and the interest in the subject is a part of a three-way relationship between the teacher and the student and the material. And for an adolescent, that connection with the teacher is vital. And the teacher also knows the kid well and can pitch to the kid in a way that works. The teacher, as Plato would say, understands the soul of the student they're teaching. And this is especially true when you've got a school where you've got 12 or 13 kids in a biology class where it's possible to get to know the kids. I learned this lesson very powerfly in my very first year of teaching, in 1980, when I was teaching a Greek class with 3 students. And you couldn't have had 3 more different, they were all bright, talented students. But one of them was incredibly systematic and organized about how she approached the subject. If Hannibal had had her in the army, Rome would have fallen. I mean, she was impressive. And there was another who got things after sort of a back and forth give and take. They were very, very different styles, and being able to pitch to them was I realized I had to sort of change my game regularly through the course of a class. So in those encounters, the kind of give and take happens that can really, begin to awaken something in the kid. They begin to understand something. The other thing I'll add about this is that three-way relationship, and especially being able to work from the teacher's side, being able to work with students whom you know well. That's one of the things that keeps teaching fresh. When I came to Commonwealth, I was astounded by the longtime teachers there who had been teaching, in some cases, some of the same texts for many years. but they were as fresh in some ways as a first-year teacher. And what I realized is it's because you never teach the same text twice when you've got a different collection of kids and a different group of students with whom you're engaging, because their responses are always going to vary. So even after 25 years, teaching Gatsby or Hurston is not like it was before. Okay, so that's that sort of adaptability and the relational quality between a teacher and a student is something very different from the encounter between a fixed text and a student, which is why, you know, when we are teaching kids texts, we're talking about them. Okay. Now, is everybody with me so far? Is anybody lost or mystified? Okay. Therese, it's a very good distinction, the written brief versus the oral argument in law. Yeah. So Plato wrote, there's also a letter. There's a series of letters which were ascribed to Plato, and his seventh letter is the longest and the most well-known. And it's, I think the scholarly consensus at least 20 years ago was that it really was Plato who wrote it. And it's about, he had traveled to Sicily and he had been in the court of a tyrant of Syracuse, and the tyrant of Syracuse, after Plato broke with him and left, was making claims that he understood all Plato's teachings because he had copies of Plato's, you know, books. And Plato in his letter said, no, he doesn't get it. And this passage is, if you're interested in Plato, it's one that's pretty well known. There does not exist, nor could there ever be, a written work of mine about these matters, the teaching of arete, for it is in no way communicable in words like other studies, but when one has lived and had much communion with the matter itself, then suddenly like a light it's kindled by a leaping spark. It is itself born in the soul and thereafter nourishes itself. And if I had thought that these matters should be fully stated in writing or in speech to the public, what nobler action could we have done in life than to write this great benefit for mankind and bring the nature of reality to light for all. So this guy who had written close to 30 dialogues says, you know, you're not going to find what I teach in books. And it's an interesting, that's an interesting proposition. And what I want to talk about here is the difference between knowing or mastery of information and understanding, deeply understanding something. Nowadays, we have unprecedented access to information. We know that we live in an overly rich information environment. But the question is, how do we take that in and how do we make it our own? How does it, get into us? And Commonwealth teachers and sometimes students talk about moments of epiphany, moments when you get something in a way that you've never gotten it before. And those things happen in class or in conferences with teachers. In the late 1990s, when I was the admissions director, a student who'd gone off to Brown and studied engineering, a young woman came back and we were sitting in my office and she said, when I was at Commonwealth, I was always in the middle math section and I never saw myself as a really strong math student. She said, but I went down to Brown, and suddenly in the engineering program, other kids were coming to me for explanations about the math that we were doing. And what I realized was that I'd really been taught to understand it, to get it deeply, as opposed to just sort of learn to manipulate formulas or the like. And she, to her mind, that was the most valuable thing that she'd taken away. And I remember another student, Jeff Doucette, who was talking at an admissions event, and he talked about the moment in a conference in 10th grade with his 10th grade English teacher, when they were talking about his writing, where it suddenly dawned on him, I mean, kids come in and they say, tell me what to do so that I do it right. All right. And in the conference and conversation with, it might have been Kate Bluestein, he said, it dawned on me that, wait, this was something that I had power over and that I had choice over. And that there wasn't going to be a right answer as to how to do it, but that it was something that, I had to learn to apply myself intelligently, sort of moment by moment. And he said, at that moment, I became a much better writer. And if you talk to kids, the number of, maybe if we polled enough alumni out there, you may remember moments where some sort of transformation took place where you understood something, this is what they're getting at deeply, and realized that it wasn't, that it was something, the teacher was asking something of you, that it was eliciting something that was in you that would come out and that was going to make a difference in the way you worked going forward. Students at graduation have commented on particular teachers, so-and-so taught me how to read. My own daughter, who went to Commonwealth, came out of a conference with Judith Saporin, sort of wide-eyed, saying, just amazed at what could be found in a text and what Judith had shown her could be done. These kinds of discoveries shift a kid. It gives the kid a real sense of agency and control. And although Plato might have not have been speaking exactly of that, but it is like the kindling of a spark that's, born in a kid and that sticks with them, that stays with them and is nourishes itself, after that. Okay. Now, here's the, so to the question of, but wait a minute, this guy wrote a bunch of dialogues. Charles Griswold is a classicist at Boston University, and I loved this book when I was doing my my seminar back almost 30 years ago. He said, Plato shares with Socrates the view that dialectic, the knowledge of asking and answering questions, cannot be taught verbally in the way, say, that someone might be taught to count from 1 to 10. The activity of coming to an insight and the insight itself must be experienced in order to be understood. To do otherwise is to fall prey to the danger prophesied by Thamus, the Egyptian king cited in Phaedrus, that of memorizing information obtained from without instead of remembering knowledge from within. Hence, it makes sense for Plato to show us what dialectic is. Moreover, writing dialogues also allows Plato to emphasize the view that philosophy cannot remove itself totally from the level of particularity. The beginning point of philosophizing, namely ordinary experience, is never left behind. And he then goes on to say the Platonic dialogue form goes some way toward countering Socrates' fear that writings will serve as pretexts for dogmatism. The dialogue form has been used in a catechistic matter, but not by Plato. So, memorizing what Plato said in his dialogues is bad reading of his dialogues. But a couple of points to mention here. Plato's dialogues, begin on the street, and they're miniature dramas with particular characters. Meno is this arrogant noble who expects to hear from Socrates, sort of the latest thing that he'll be able to take away and quote at cocktail parties. Socrates, in another dialogue, has a discussion about courage with two generals, one of whom is this sort of rough and tumble, gruff character, and the other is kind of an intellectual general, kind of a David Petraeus sort, and they come at the question and the conversation from very different ways. But what happens in the Platonic dialogues very often is that they all wind up confused. Nobody gets what Socrates is driving at. What he does get them to do is to realize that all that they thought they knew, they really doesn't necessarily hold up. And so in the Platonic dialogue, there's this interesting dynamic between this drama that's going on in the page and the reader's response as well. And you have to be a good reader to get, to sort of sense in, all that's going on in the dialogue. That also goes to the question of, this is a bit of a tangent, but Socratic irony. I love talking to ninth graders about irony because they're so good at it. They're usually good at sarcasm. And we talk about the difference between sarcasm and irony. And when I talk about irony, irony is essentially a communication in which there is the surface statement is very different from what is intended. If a kid comes into class late, has forgotten his shoes, forgotten the book bag, and is totally disheveled, and I look at the kid and say, "Huh, you're having a good day today." All right. It takes something on the part of the student to realize that I don't mean what I say. All right. It kind of jolts the student. What do you mean? And then suddenly they realize the irony. And in that disconnect, they have a chance to sort of wake up and get a bit of perspective on their own situation. Irony places on the listener the responsibility to recognize the difference between what's being said on the surface and what's really meant. In Platonic dialogues, the same thing happened, the same dynamic is at play with the reader. It's the responsibility, if you miss Socrates' irony on the written page, you're not reading well, and you're not going to get what's going on in the dialogue. So Plato's dialogues, in a way, are these written works that sort of, in a way, transcend almost the limitations of writing. And I want to take a minute here to also talk about the limits. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this tonight is because I believe so deeply in the value of face-to-face. And that's the reason that this last year, my last year at Commonwealth, which has been conducted so much over Zoom, has the effect of it has only been to strengthen my convictions. Because, in an environment like this, in a format like this, so much is lost, even with the video connection and the sound connection. There are so many subtle signals that aren't picked up, and that make the kind of disconnect, that create more of a disconnect than is the case in face-to-face. I read an article actually a couple days ago about Zoom fatigue, and one of the factors in Zoom fatigue is that in order to communicate to the other person, to the person on the other side of the connection, that I understand what they're saying, or I'm listening, or the like, my response has to be exaggerated. Okay. And that sort of extra effort contributes to the fatigue. All right. So Plato's genius was to use a form of writing that pushed against the limits. Socrates engages with these particular individuals who sometimes get what he says, sometimes don't, but leaving it up to the reader to take away what he will. He very often leaves questions open at the end of the dialogues. This is not quite an aside, but this is a famous quotation. Plato's probably the most famous quotation from Plato about education. It's from his allegory of the cave, where he says we humans are, creatures sort of chained in a cave, looking at shadows on a wall, which we think are reality. But if somebody frees us from our chains and turns us around and takes us up, we see the fire and the objects whose shadows are cast on the wall, and realize that all we saw were shadows. And eventually we can get dragged out of the cave and see the sun, which is the ultimate source of light, and understand reality at its deepest. But that's the allegory. And he says education is not what certain men profess it to be, they presumably assert that they put into the soul knowledge that isn't there, as though they were putting sight into blind eyes. But the present argument, on the other hand, indicates that this power is in the soul of each, the power to understand, and that the instrument with which each learns, just as the eye is not able to turn toward the light from the dark without the whole body, the instrument with which each learns must be turned around from that which is coming into being together with the whole soul, until it is able to endure looking at that which is and the brightest part of that which is. We won't go into the difference between becoming and being and Plato's metaphysics, but education is a turning of the soul. It's not pouring information into the head. It's not dogmatic, okay? And this goes back again to that opening quotation about philosophy. It's not being able to, summarize Plato's allegory of the cave on the test, but it's sort of taking from that something that changes the way one understands the world. Back to philosophy as therapy, as it were, versus theory. All right. So that's my quick trot through Plato. How does this all apply to us? Well, I've been talking about how it applies to us, but I think I'll go back to a little bit of history. Before Charles Merrill founded Commonwealth, he helped found a school in suburban St. Louis called Thomas Jefferson School with a Harvard classmate of his named Robin McCoy. And in the walled garden, he said that the school was based upon books 6, 7, and 8 of Plato's Republic to train the philosopher princes of the future. And I was told when I came that this was an idea that they bandied about at a meal when they were undergraduates together. And they said, where is the next generation of leaders in the United States going to come from? And they figured the Midwest, where oil money was and the like, that was where they would go and start their school. So I'm not stretching too far to bring Plato into a conversation about Commonwealth. I'm just, that's the point of this quotation. But Charles left Thomas Jefferson, came to Boston, and built his, and bought his brownstones. All right. So here is the if you talk to people in the independent school world, other heads, and say I'm from Commonwealth School, if a head has heard of Commonwealth School, they will say, oh, Commonwealth, no roller skating in the hallways, the place with no rules. Well, I say, no, there's one rule. And this is Charles's text in the walled garden about that. The summary of discipline that I announce each opening day is don't roller skate in the hallways. That's a way essentially of saying, don't be a damn fool, give some thought to what you do and how your actions affect other people. If you make a mistake, someone will point it out and it's not too important, but don't keep making the same one. I try to avoid law codes such as the lycée in Warsaw one student came from, where there were 2,300 rules and he set out as a simple challenge to break each one. I distrust law. I'm afraid. One sets up a neat punishment to get crafty, then poor old simple blunders into it. I prefer to keep the options open, relying upon the student's understanding of what usually happens when something goes too far. If our common law discipline system has worked reasonably well, it has been because of the close contact always between some adults and youngsters, enough interesting courses to make it worthwhile to play ball, and the loyalty and goodwill of most of the students. And so he's talking in there, if I've done my job this evening, you'll see some connections here. Law, the kind of law that Charles Merrill distrusts is his distrust of that is parallel to Plato's distrust of writing. It's one size fits all. It speaks the same to everyone. And if you look at the end there, he's talking about the importance of the personal connection. If our common law discipline system has worked well, the close contact always between some adults and youngsters. All right. Now, and that is a question, incidentally, that if there are ever any concerns about a student, one of the things that I'm always most interested in is, does that kid have an adult in the school whom they're talking to, whom they trust? And if that's the case, I think we've got a good shot in helping the kid through whatever difficult spell they're in the midst of. And what I take heart from, I mean, it's been an interesting year with COVID, and of course we had the petition and a lot of soul searching that was sparked over the summer by that petition. But real problems were pointed out, problems that we have to address and that we are addressing. But what I also realized is there was a lot that we did that was good, because among other things, all those petitioners had adults in the school with whom, as students, they spoke regularly and who they continue to speak and communicate with. There were a lot of conversations that went on after that whole episode with, between teachers who'd been advisors to students and those students. And, as long as those bonds and those relationships are in place, we're able to play ball. And to show that to give equal time to different heads of school, this is Judith Keenan, who ran the school from 1990 to 2000, coming from a career as a senior aide to a US Senator in Washington, and returning to that after she finished up at Commonwealth. But she wrote, "Young people bring to their high school years the raw intellectual and physical powers of adulthood, but little of the wisdom that comes with experience. At Commonwealth, they develop and refine those powers by making a broad range of academic subjects, arts, and sports part of their daily lives. We trust that our students' learning goes well beyond the subjects they study. School life is a continuing discourse that requires a healthy respect for the ideas of others, a willingness to listen as well as a readiness to talk, a commitment to the delicate balance that in any community reconciles individual and common concerns. Our students learn that words have meaning and actions have consequences, that asking questions is often more important than answering them, that thinking for oneself and speaking one's mind matter, although the courage to do so may not come easily, and that in the end, none of us can be indifferent to the welfare of others. We cannot make young people wise, but by the manner in which we engage each other in our daily pursuits, we can help them see which way wisdom lies. We offer our students the opportunity to develop the strengths of mind, body, and spirit that will enable them to lead constructive and rewarding lives, and in good time to work at making our fractious and uncertain world a better place." And that first sentence of the final paragraph goes right back to Mino's question. Can we teach arete? How does one impart arete? And I'll say as well that one of the great joys of working in a school like Commonwealth is seeing the unfolding of this process over the course of 4 years. Those moments of insight that I spoke about earlier, where the kid understands math or realizes that they have that the quality of their writing is in their own power. But and especially sometimes in 11th and 11th to 12th grade, there's really an unfolding where the kids are coming into their own and making the transition from child to young adult. That's incredibly fun to watch. And you don't know exactly when it's going to happen. You don't know how it's going to happen. But in a school, in a school where teachers and students know each other well and are working closely, and everybody understands that we're in it together, that process has a much better chance of going well. And here is I'll end with Plato. This is a beautiful passage that could sum up in different language our mission. I think that Plato says toward the end of Phaedrus, when he's talking about rhetoric, he says, he's talking much more beautiful than writing is earnestness about these subjects when someone makes use of the art of dialectic, question and answer, by laying hold of a suitable soul, and plants and sows words with understanding, which are able to defend themselves and their sower, and are not sterile, but produce seed of their own, from which other words may grow in other natures, which are able forever to vouchsafe immortality to the seed and render their possessor as blessed as is possible for a human. Now, that is elegant and flowery, but what he's essentially saying is that these, yeah, that's Don Connolly, these moments of when a kid gets something, when you sit down with, Mr. Barcy or Ms. Sundberg or Ms. Brewster, and you understand something about what's being asked of you, their words sort of get into you, and that's going to unfold in a way that is really kind of mysterious. And that invariably winds up getting passed on. And one of the great joys of teaching is having students come back to you after many years and recalling to you something that you said that may have been a casual remark that wound up making a huge difference for them. These words that we plant in our kids wind up bearing fruit for a long time ahead. So we encourage these moments of epiphany, which gives students something to take away, a sense of what it is to own a question or topic. And as I said, they take it in directions that we can't predict. And that's one of the great mysteries of this profession. And when we have opportunities to get together and hear stories about how things have made a difference, that's one of the great rewards of this work. I'll tell one more story. I was talking to a group of seniors, and Brent, your daughter, was in this class, and something had happened. There was, for some reason, drugs and alcohol were the topic of conversation, and I started talking to them about this, and I started talking to them about why we care about it. We said, we know you guys, we like you guys. You're playing Russian roulette if you're dealing with this stuff, and ask any members of my generation, ask your teachers. We all know casualties, tragic casualties along the way, and we don't want that to happen. And one student essentially said, well, why are you telling us this if you know we're not going to listen? Or if we're not going to really listen or pay attention. And I said, you guys are going to be parents someday. And part of what you're going to find yourself doing is telling your kids things over and over that you know they're not listening to. But if you don't say it, the sentence doesn't get into their heads. And so at that moment, when they may be making some significant choice, there's going to be nothing to counter that, well, why don't you just go ahead voice. So that's something that you really need to do. So never hesitate from speaking what you think a kid needs to hear. And 50 minutes later, Farhad Riahi came back to me and he said, Bill, what did you say to those students? They came into class and they were talking. They were deeply impressed. And I told him. He said, well, they listened. So that's why we keep at it. Vouchsafe immortality. I think passing on these lessons about human connection, about developing one's capacities, about communication, on which so much in our own lives and lives in our communities depend. So once again, it has been, I'm getting emotional, but it has been an incredible privilege to spend a career in a community like this, in a school like this. I will tell you, over the last 20 years, you always get calls from headhunters saying, how would you like to, go to this, or there's an opening here. And a couple of times I've looked, And and every time I've found that, you know, being a headmaster even in a school twice the size of Commonwealth, you're removed from the kids, you're removed from where the work is happening, where these conversations are taking place. And you're a lot more like a CEO of an organization. And so to be in a place where kids walk through your office door, ask questions, complain, make proposals, where you can argue with teachers about how we should do this or how we should do that. It's been an incredible privilege, and I'd probably do it over again if I had the chance.